Mixing with Mike, plugin of the week is Overloud Comp LA. Comp LA is nothing to do with Los Angeles. It has to do with LA2A and LA3A emulations that Overloud has done. So what we have here is pretty straightforward. It's just an optical limiter, just like the ones that you've seen over and over again from different manufacturers. It's the reason for that is it's a classic, an all-time classic. Almost every studio seemed to have an LA2A, a Teletronics one from the from the studios that I worked in anyway. Most pro studios did have them. And later on, there were other companies like TubeTech that would create optical limiters that would also sort of emulate the same sound and characteristics of the LA2A. It's an all-time classic, created back in the late 50s, early 60s, really designed as a broadcast limiter for radio use. The person who designed it, I believe, worked in the military, and optical components or optics was his specialty, and he ended up working in radio and was sick of trying to chase the person who was doing the broadcast and adjusting the levels, so he designed a device that would actually control things, and hence it was born. The whole idea or concept of it is that you have a light source, which is basically an electroluminescent light fed to a photoelectric cell, which converts that back into an electrical current. And the way that that's handled, or that transition of light energy back to electricity, is part of where the compression gain can be controlled. So it's kind of using the limitations of the technology in order to apply compression. Essentially, what you have is an output gain control and a peak reduction control. So this determines the amount of gain reduction. You have a meter in here that will show input, gain reduction, output, or actual harmonic distortion, which is something that doesn't, you won't see that on the original for sure. You have two modes, limit and compress. All right, so you can switch between those there. Pretty straightforward. And then everything down here is added features. So what you have is an LA2A, which is an actual tube, actually has tubes in the circuit as part of the circuit design, and that'll give it certain sonic characteristics. And they created something that was less expensive that took away the tube, was easier to maintain, and that was the LA3A. And so that was released. It's also in a smaller design. So actually this was a full 3 rack space vertical and a full rack space wide, whereas the 3A was actually a half rack space wide. It was only 2 units high or tall. And so often these were mounted as stereo pairs right next to each other, so they would sit side by side. So it's actually the graphics here are not reflecting that at all, but often when you see other emulations, you'll see that the size is more relative to what it is. Either way, they have different characteristic sounds, and what I really love more than anything about this is just having the ability to have both of them available to you in the same plugin. I just love that because similar to like Silverface and Blackface 1176s, they have a different characteristic sound to them and different tonal character, and the ability to switch between them often makes the choices a lot easier than having to go through and set up multiple instantiations and trying to bypass them to compare them and matching up settings. So it's a great idea, really brilliant idea. Simple switch between the two of them. Essentially, what you have is a solid state circuit that's used, or transistor circuits that's used solid state that's used in the 3A versus the tube circuit, which is used in the 2A. So it gets a different characteristic sound. It has faster attack, and the basic tonal frequency spectrum is a little bit different as well. So with this, you'll kind of get slightly carved out mid-range, a little bit more air, and a little bit more on the low end. And when you go to the tube tube version, right, the 2A, you'll get a characteristic that has a bit more mid-range character to it. And it works particularly well for given instruments. So I would say that in most sessions that I worked in, if you had a pair of 1176s, of LA2As, they would end up most of the time on the vocal and the bass. Those are two areas where they just seem to really shine. The optical component has this way of bringing, like what I like to call shining a light on something, particularly things that are very dark. So if you have a dark sound and it doesn't quite image well, or you're having difficulty getting it to image well, this is the magic sauce for that. There's something powerful about that, the harmonics that you can add in. Now, there are some additional features which are added in. So aside from the 2A, 3A circuit, okay, and we'll get into some of the attack settings and stuff like that in a minute. You could go stereo or mid-side if you're working in a stereo module. This is just a single one. You have control over the input level and output level, right? So you can kind of pre-feeding into this, either drive it more or the opposite, give it more headroom, whatever you decide. You can add in harmonic distortion separately. So when you mix in the sound, you can actually overdrive it without changing any of the gain reduction characteristics, or keep it linear. So this is original. You can make it so that you get the characteristics without any harmonic distortion. And that's actually, it's a lot cooler than what I thought it would be. I thought it was like, oh, it's just giving you basically a digital thing, but it actually allows you to control the cleanliness of it. So something like a bass, you may want to drive a bit more, or a vocal, if you want it to be a little more aggressive, you could drive it a little bit more, or if you want it to be really pure and clean, you could drive it more towards the linear. And then there's a low frequency sensitivity. So this is essentially it's kind of strange the way they write it up here, because it more or less is just a high pass filter. So you're rolling off low frequency. So I'm not sure what the -10 indication is. There's nothing I can find in the manual that talks about that. So it could just be that if you're increasing the amount of attenuation at a fixed frequency, that it extends farther up the spectrum. Maybe that's kind of what's going on, but it's not a sweepable frequency as they show it here. So, and there's no numbers that display, so you're basically doing it by ear. This will basically help to control the gain reduction characteristic. So it essentially is sidechain stuff. Signal comes in, it splits, it goes through a filter, and then that filtered signal is what's fed into the optical circuit for applying gain reduction. All right, so that's the basics of it. You guys have used this. I'm sure most of you have used this all the time on many things. There's also a compression off thing there, which no gain reduction, and then that would allow you just to use it for harmonic distortion characteristics. So let's go over just something that, a couple quick things. One, the bass, because it's such a powerful thing on bass. I'm going to move the level of the bass up here temporarily, and let's just listen to it with this bypassed. And we'll start there, and then we'll go over some of the characteristics of it. World's not my home. How about I move over to where the bass is? That's a good idea. Here we go. So right there, immediately you can hear how it just sort of focuses the sound of the bass in. You know, there's something really special about that. I want you to also notice the tonal characteristic difference between that and the solid state version, or the 3A version. So you could hear, like in this, what I hear is a bit more presence in air on the 3A. I kind of prefer the 3A, which is not a usual thing. I normally always go to a 2A for this type of thing, but it happens to work pretty well right here. Another thing you can do with either of these is work in limit mode, which is something that is not often, I don't think people really look at. Some of the characteristic things that happen when you go to limit mode versus compress mode is you get a faster attack time. Also, the 3A will have a faster attack, more aggressive attack than the tube version, the 2A version. So you have some other controls here in terms of the way that this operates, and then also there's a multi-stage release, so I didn't really talk about. The multi-stage release really allows for approximately 70 millisecond initial release, and then a recovery that's anywhere from 500 milliseconds to 5 seconds, depending upon how deep you are into compression and what happens there. So that would be the full recovery. And it has a characteristic shape to it, the way that it kind of holds onto the signal. So it's not so much like how long it takes for the signal to fully decay, but the shape of that decay that ends up being an important part of the sound. And it's a thing that you need to listen for in terms of how responsive it is. So if you find that it's not responsive at all, this is where doing the low frequency sensitivity setting can help to kind of control that. So you can manage those. And with all these settings, it's amazing how many different options you can get in terms of sound. All right, so let's drive this a little bit and see what that sounds like. Here, I'm going to go to a place where it's going to be a little bit heavier. Sorry, a little bit sloppy there in terms of the performance, but you could hear how you can drive that a little bit. I think in the right sound that actually can work really well. I didn't overdrive LA2As a whole lot, but you know, it can work really well here. I'm going to show the linear characteristic on the vocal and kind of get into that, but I do want to show the limit feature, which will help to kind of sort of soften the edge or attack of something. So let's go back to the drum intro. Here we go. And you could hear that subtle difference there where the increased attack starts to cut down. I actually prefer the compression, which is the mode I use most of the time. But it's quite cool, right? So that's one main use. The other one is the vocal, which I'll kind of show off here real quick. And so let me skip over to a verse section. Call this up. So this occurs over multiple tracks if you happen to notice the meters. And I have them all linked together so the settings are all identical here. So let's start with a vocal here.
The world is not my home. I'm passing through something greater than this life that I must be living for. And earthly treasures had me bound, and they always tear me down. And in the shelter of your arms, you'll always find me there. I cast my cares, I find you there. In the river.
That's the next track.
And I cast my cares, I find you there.
So this actually, here, I kind of like the 3A here. Again, not one that I always typically like. Actually, I've used the 3A a lot on vocals. It's really great. So, but this actually works incredibly well. I wanted to do the linear thing, as I was saying before. So let's check that out here and compare that to the original.
The world is not my home. I'm passing through something greater than this life that I must be living for. and earthly treasures had me bound, and they always tear me down.
Very subtle, but there is like a nice clarity about that I kind of like. Distortion is great on everything, all the time. That actually sounds quite good. Really like that. There's also a parallel, which I don't think I mentioned before, which is mixed in here, so that's available to you. Yeah, I mean, so here again, it's pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward. I just want to check the limiter here, limiter setting, and see if this will help to kind of cut a little bit of the edge of the vocal.
The world is not my home. I'm passing through.
Versus the compress.
The world is not my home. I'm passing through.
Not a big difference there. I thought it might cut a little bit. There's actually some sibilance in there that's going to be dealt with better in another location. One other thing I just wanted to show here, because actually I really think this sounds great. I'm really impressed by their emulation of this, especially the 3A. I feel like I've been fighting for a really good 3A, and everything that's out there that I find is pretty old. So whatever you think, that one is going to be a good one, because one of the classic things I really like to use the 3A on is on electric guitars. Here, I'll skip over to a section where they play a little more. Well, let's hear this in the context of the track, because I almost kind of like the 2A better here for the guitars. So let's see.
Treasures had me bound.
Those are guitars that are hard left and right, and the 3A just really, it seems to give it like a nice presence. So in solo, it sounds a little bit different there, but actually I really like what it does for them in the mix here. Actually, this is a really great emulation. I'm actually very impressed with this. Nice work by Overloud, excuse me. I think they've done an excellent emulation. Really captured the characteristics, the sound, the feel of it, which is so important. It sounds like just a simple thing. I almost judge the quality of an emulation based on that, because all of the units are going to sound different from each other. But also the added features in here, which you don't see on most of the emulations that are out there, the parallel, the ability to add in harmonics and distortion, take away the gain reduction, drive it more, input-output gains, gives a lot of flexibility, and I just love the fact that this is available here to give you the two options to work with. So nice one. Nice work, and actually a really cool one. Nice, I think a valuable tool to add to a plugin collection if you don't have a good combination of LA2A and LA3A. Plugin of the week by Mixing with Mike, Overloud Comp LA.